We're going to turn now to an interview that we did back in 2008 with the Reverend Richard Stewart, now deceased, in which he talks about the early history of African American churches in the Buffalo region.
Cool.
Welcome to our second segment of Kaleidoscope. I'm the Reverend Stan Bratton, and I'm joined by Reverend Richard Stewart. And Reverend Stewart is the pastor of the Durham Memorial AME Zion Church here in Buffalo, and also known for hosting the Central City Cafe. Thank you for joining us, Reverend Stewart.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you this morning.
And to join and to kind of talk about the church history of African American churches here in Western New York. But let me just begin by saying, what led you to begin to be interested in this and do the research that you've done?
As a young man, I met people like Mary Crosby Chappell, who taught us that we should know our history, the history of our people, the history of our being in this country. And after that, I began just reading and searching. I was a member of St. Luke AME Zion Church, and I learned its history. And then I began just reading and learning the history of different churches in the greater Buffalo area. And it's almost become an obsession with me now to learn something about every church that's in our community.
Now, what would you say to others about why this matters?
Well, we're taught that if you don't know your past, you don't really know where the future is going to be. And what's happening today is affected by what happened in the past. And so I try to help our people understand that we did not just evolve as churches, but through trials, tribulation, through struggles, our churches evolved. We took almost nothing and created some of the greatest churches in the world. And so I think it's important to know the struggles of others, that we can appreciate what we have today.
Now, let's start. How about the year 1832? That's when Buffalo was first incorporated, and there was already an African American community in Buffalo at that time.
Yes, blacks were worshiping in the Buffalo area for years before the incorporation of Buffalo. My history traces an AME Zion presence here back to 1828. Of course, we have our first organized body of worshipers in 1831 when the Colored Methodist Society had been created, which was a group of African Americans worshiping. And they did not affiliate with the denomination until the latter part of 1831. And from that humble beginning, all of the churches that we have today evolved.
Now, there emerged two societies, is that correct?
Yes.
In this early stage?
In the early stages, in 1831, you had the Colored Methodist Society, which eventually became the Bethel AME Church. And around 1839, 1840-ish, you had the Michigan Street Baptist Church. This is where a group of African Americans withdrew from the First Baptist Church of Buffalo, which was a predominantly white congregation that allowed blacks to attend. And so they withdrew, and at first they called it the Second Baptist Church, but there was a little turmoil there, and they were challenged not to use the name Second Baptist. So they found some property on Michigan Avenue, I believe it was Michigan Street at the time, and built their church there, and it became known as the Michigan Street Baptist Church.
So now, was that the first physical building here in the Buffalo area, or African American church building?
Well, there was the Vine Street Church. There was a church, the Methodist Church on Vine Street. Vine Street is that stretch of William Street that crosses Michigan up to Oak Street. That was called Vine Alley, and that's where the Methodist Church and the African Methodist School were located. So that there was a physical building there. I have not had enough history to understand who built that building, but the Michigan Street Baptist Church, between its incorporation in the mid-40s, 1840s, they were able to build the Michigan Street Baptist Church, building first the basement, worshiping in there for a number of years, and eventually completing that building.
Now, we look at the history of talking about the Underground Railroads coming through here for folks to get into Canada. How much of a role did these two churches have within the Underground Railroad?
Michigan Street Baptist Church played a vital role. Many blacks came there, and in the Michigan Street Baptist Church, there is a small area under a stairwell where they hid the escaping slaves. One story is said that the sheriff knew that they were going in there, but when he would go in, he could never find them. And he sat in the basement, the dining area, going to wait for them to come out, to appear. And they just stayed hidden until he finally got tired and left. But then when it was at apple time, they would sneak out of the Michigan Street Baptist Church, heading toward the foot of Ferry Street, where they crossed over into Canada. So that church was historic in harboring escaped slaves.
Now, just in my own kind of looking at the history, there was the story of Frederick Douglass coming and speaking.
Yes.
I think particularly at the Michigan Church.
Yes, Frederick Douglass spoke a number of times in the Buffalo area. Sometimes inside that church, and other times in parks and other public places. But he and a number of other abolitionists Buffalo was a regular stop for them. So they came through here telling their story and urging our people on to Canada, because at that time that was the only place they could go and be free. And a great African American community arose on the Canadian side.
Now, Harriet Tubman also came through here.
Harriet Tubman was one of those persons that came through this area, and all from up along the western New York, Jamestown, Elmira, Ithaca, all were stops on the Underground Railroad. And many of the A.M.E. Zion churches were actual stops, or the parsages where slaves were hidden until they could pass over into Canada.
Now, we're now moving towards the time of the Civil War. What happened to these two individual congregations?
They continued to grow. They became very prosperous congregations. They provided many services for the African American community in Buffalo. Their pastors served as leaders during that period of time. And then the number of other churches broke away from those two churches. The Colored Methodist Society eventually became the Bethel AME Church,
which is often spoken of as the mother church in this
the
area?
Mother church, yes. See, our history tells us that there was an AME Zion presence in Buffalo prior to 1831. We've traced a Buffalonian to New York, to the New York Annual Conference of the AME Zion Church as early as 1827, 1828. He answered the roll call, and our early church history lists church in progress in Buffalo. That's one of the things that I'm working on, trying to find more documentation of our presence here. But St. Luke AME Zion Church was one of those churches that left the Bethel Church in 1902.
Now, is this any way connected with this split between the AMA, African American Episcopal Church, and the African American Episcopal Zion Church?
Well, Sam, one has to understand that prior to 1848, both groups called themselves AME, or African Methodist Episcopal. The Philadelphia group, organized by Richard Allen, and the New York group, organized by James Varick, both used the name African Methodist Episcopal. Methodist Episcopal because they were members of the Methodist Episcopal congregation, either in Philadelphia or New York, and they added African to let Africans know. Well, that's what we were called then. I mean, since then we've become colored, Negroes, black, so many names. But originally we were Africans because we came from Africa. And so you had two groups with the same name. And it wasn't until 1848 that the Zion branch added Zion to the AME to differentiate between the Philadelphia and the New York group. And so history that we have today may call one AME and one AME Zion, but you know, it's not always known which was which. And I think in the case of Buffalo, we had people from Buffalo going to New York, joining up with the Zion branch of the AME Church, and then possibly that same group might have contacted the Philadelphia people and eventually joined there, because that had happened all over the country. I know I've seen one church, it's Bell, over 100 years old, the church Bell has on their AME, but it's an AME Zion congregation because they didn't add the Zion until 1848. Okay, so St. Luke left Bethel in the early 1900s. There was really 3 congregations broke away from Bethel AME Church, which would have been the St. Luke group, the Lloyd's Memorial congregation, and a Presbyterian group. All withdrew and formed different congregations. Well, St. Luke, of course, is now St. Luke AME Zion
on East Ferry
Street. But originally it was at Michigan and Eagle, where I am, Durham Memorial. St. Luke built that building. And then the Lloyd's Memorial congregation went its separate way. And today they're known as the New Covenant United Church of Christ, a group of mergers of different United
where
Churches
Will
of Christ.
Brown is at this point. Yes.
Several United Church of Christ congregations merged and built New Covenant.
So where your church is now on Michigan and East Eagle, that used to be St. Luke's AME Zion.
That's correct. Used to be St. Luke's AME Zion. It was built by St. Luke's 1922, 1923. It was, or it is, the second oldest African-American congregation in its original building. So it was built by African-Americans, and today it still houses an African-American congregation. Michigan Street Baptist Church would be the oldest physical building built by African-Americans. It no longer houses the Michigan Street Baptist Church, but it has a different ministry. Bethel Ministries are there now. Michigan Street moved to a new location. And so when it moved
when was that?
I don't know. I don't have the year offhand. But when it did move to a new location, it changed its name from Michigan Street to the Humboldt Parkway Baptist Church. Okay.
Well, there's really a lot more that we ought to talk about. We're sort of running out of time today, but it's really a fascinating story of the development of the African-American churches here. And I think there's a whole new story that begins in the 60s when many of the churches abandoned by white churches were taken over by African-American churches. Reverend Richard Stewart, thank you for joining us on Kaleidoscope, and we want to have you back and go further with this. It's certainly a fascinating history.